meeting to order. The statement on public input. The public is allowed to speak at public comment after first being recognized by the chair, except that any complaints or comments regarding individually identifiable police officers are not allowed. Rather, any such comments or complaints may be provided to the board in writing, and the board will forward such complaint or comment to the appropriate person within the Lawrence Police Department. The board will establish reasonable limitations on the allowable length of public comment. As a general practice, the board will not discuss or debate these items, nor will it make decisions on items presented during public input. The first item is to review the minutes. Has everybody had an opportunity to read the draft minutes?
Yes.
Are there any changes or discussion regarding the minutes? Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Okay, Dr. Mishner, and second?
Second.
Okay. Ms. Littleton? The minutes are approved. We're fortunate today to get a discussion and presentation from the Law Enforcement Contact Study by Mr., am I going to say it right, Bianecki?
Robert Bianecki, yes.
Bianecki, okay.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for allowing us time in your agenda to talk about the study. A little bit, I wanted to just kind of talk about in the beginning about our council and how the study was born and where we're at today. And then I'll have Zach McDevitt from Northeastern University come up and talk through the study some. My background's in law enforcement. I'm a retired captain from Johnson County Sheriff's Office, just next door. I came into this job in 2016 when this council was started by resolution to the county commission. So, a couple 2.5 years. I think all of you have a copy of what our council looks like. 23 members. We just increased it from 15. You can see all the police chiefs are on there from all the jurisdictions in the county, as well as a chief judge, a municipal judge here in Lawrence, some people from the community, a former consumer now, and so we have a pretty diverse and pretty good council. So how this study came about was right after the council formed. They had a retreat and they talked about what was important to them, and disproportionate minority contact was at the top of the list. So back then, in late 2016, we formed a subcommittee of the council. Back then, Chief Katib, the Lawrence PD chief, headed up that, and his advice to us all was, if we're going to study this, let's do it right, the right way. If we're going to collect data, we're going to collect it for the right reasons and have it analyzed by a scientist that's skilled and experienced in it. So pretty good advice, and so we brought that subcommittee together, and Lori Friedel is a national expert in this area. She actually has a company that teaches police agencies about implicit bias and bias training. So we contacted her and said, hey, what can you do to help us out? We wanted her to come and research, and she's too busy. She said, hey, there's 4 other people that I would recommend, and Northeastern University was on that list. So as we studied the topic and looked at how to approach it, we thought that a study of this sort, of this magnitude, would be appropriate and would be good for us. And so I think you all have a copy of the contract, the scope. and the interagency or cooperative agreement that talks about how we all came together, funded it, and we signed off on that in December of last year. And we kicked it off in January with a site visit with a couple of the researchers. They were back in town today. We had another meeting with all the police chiefs and some of their command staff and the sheriff, talking about how we're going to, what data, what format, how we're going to do it, and we started right there, and we hope our goal is to start collecting that data by late summer, early fall, and the project is contracted for a couple of years. So that's kind of the background to where we are now, and I'll let Jack introduce himself and also take you through some of that process and how we'll end and what will be reported out. Do you have any questions for me?
I have a general one.
Yes, sir.
There was a survey taken, or I guess the right word is survey, about, what was it, about 18 months ago? And how much has that survey informed what you're doing now?
Nothing, not at all. So we weren't involved in that survey. My understanding was that survey was contracted or through the city.
It was, and it was not scientific.
Yeah. So this study will be based on current data. It'll be based on current car stops and contact. And I don't know much about that study and how that study came about, so I can't really answer this question.
I know Dr. Gibson had some specific questions about the old study and the methodologies and things. And I don't know if it's accurate to say there was some general dissatisfaction with the approach and everything. That's why I asked, did you approach that from any sort of a lessons learned or that type of inquiry?
We actually were trying to think of the timing on this. I think we were well into research and how we were going to do it, and that study had already been out there. The results weren't back, so no, I didn't look at that study. I didn't bring that to my council to look at. We're starting a very independent new research team that comes with, as Jack will tell you, with experience across the country doing these exact kind of studies and the results.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question on the budget, and maybe either you or Jack can help us, or maybe I should ask. I presume the indirect costs are what goes to the university.
The which cost?
The indirect costs of 20%.
Correct. Yes.
So where is the cost for data collection?
The data collection, the data collection will be done by officers in the field. It'll be an added step that they'll do on every car stop. It won't add. I mean, the idea is to minimize the time that the officers will have to take to document, and it's their perception, at the time as well. There are specific data fields that we're working now with the chiefs and the departments to come to have if we will, a starting place for everybody, and then it'll also document searches and those kind of things.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thanks. My name is Jack Devitt. I'm the director of the Institute for Race and Justice at Northeastern University in Boston, not Northwestern. And we have been doing analyses and developing data collection on police interactions with the public for around 15, 20 years. We've worked in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, Missouri, Seattle, Texas, different jurisdictions to try to help them collect data that would be useful to them, and also to analyze that data in a way that would give them some feedback on whether disparities exist between the way the officers are interacting with the public and whether or not that's, as proportionate to what we would think it would be. I can do a big presentation, but I was really hoping to have a dialogue a little bit and have you ask questions, get your questions answered. I'll walk you through the steps. It's in the proposal, but I'll walk you through the steps in the project. The project, well, the first step was to get buy-in from all of the agencies. It's gonna be all the agencies in Douglas County. So we met individually with each agency, explained to them what the study might do, what it won't do. You know, to give you a starting point, to know whether or not an officer is acting with bias, as a social scientist, I have to know what that officer is thinking when she makes a decision to stop a car or to stop an individual. And I can't do that. There's no way I can measure that. Maybe some of my psychologist friends might be able to do it, but I can't do it. So all I can do is say, are there patterns of behavior that officers engage in, either individually or in groups, that appear to be bias motivated? And that the best we can do is identify those patterns. And what I found is then the next step is to have a conversation with the department as to whether those patterns can be explained by some other rationale the department would have. So I'll give you an example. We've worked in agencies where all of a sudden we see this big increase of Latino kids getting stopped by the police in a particular geographic area. We say to ourselves, well, we may have ethnic profiling here. But when you drill down and you go meet with the police and talk to them, they say, well, the community members complained about a gang in the area that was starting to carry guns and have shootings with another gang. And we asked the police, the community did, to up the enforcement on that gang. That gang happened to be Latino. So we would expect for a short period of time that there'd be more stops of Latinos in that specific geographic area. It's when you can't explain it that it's a problem. Like why, you can't tell me why this is different in one place or another. So the initial phase of the study was to just get buy-in, to explain to people what we do, what we don't do, what we can do. You know, the second phase was this trip was to get everybody, or to get the police chiefs initially, to buy into what data they're going to collect. As Robert said, the way it'll be done is that each officer who does a traffic stop or a pedestrian stop, and they're trying to decide exactly who's going to do pedestrian stops, but every officer who does a traffic stop will document that. Right now they document it with a citation if they give a citation, but they don't document it in all cases if they give a warning. So in order to have every traffic stop, we need them to document every stop they make, whether it's a verbal warning, a written warning, or a citation. And that documentation will give us information on the race and ethnicity of the person stopped, the reason for the stop, whether a search was conducted, whether a citation was issued. And we'll look at all of those decision points as whether or not they're disproportionate to some benchmarks that we can use. And that's a sticky slope, and I'm happy to talk to you about benchmarks. So this meeting was to get the police to start help us understand in their jurisdiction what is it they want to collect. One example we talked about today. Everybody wants to minimize the amount of effort on police officers. You don't want to give people more paperwork. College professors don't want to do more paperwork. Police officers don't want to do more paperwork. Medical professionals don't want to do more. No one wants to do more paperwork. So the question becomes, how do we do that? But it's a balance. So the example I use is, in Massachusetts initially, the police chief said, we don't want them collecting lots of data, so when it comes to a search, we want yes or no. Did you do a search, yes or no? Okay. But when they got the data, there were big disparities in searches. Now that's pretty consistent across the country, as you know. There are pretty consistent disparities in who gets searched when the police stop someone. And there were big disparities. And when the chiefs got together, they said, well, you know, all searches aren't discretionary. Some searches are non-discretionary. So for example, search incident to arrest. You're going to make an arrest, you have to search the person, you're taking them into custody. Or a tow. You make the traffic stop, person doesn't have a license, you're not going to let them drive their car home, you have to tow the car, you're going to do an inventory search of the car so that the person's assured that everything that was in the car when it was towed is still in there when they get it back. Well, those aren't discretionary. So what the police said, well, if you take those out, do we still have disparities? But they couldn't do it because it was yes, no. So in Massachusetts, the chiefs redesigned the form to have down what was the reason for the search. Consent, reasonable, articulate facts, probable cause, you know, or a tow, incident to arrest, those kind of things. So we've done enough of these now to be able to tell people where police departments feel that they've collected data that was helpful to them and where they feel they've collected data that needed to be more detailed in order to be helpful to them. So that's the step we're at now. Then we'll come back, we'll design the form, get buy-in from the council and from the police chiefs, have this be a standardized form that all 5 agencies in the county will use. And then we'll come back and do training for the police officers, because police officers don't want to do this. They don't want to do it for the more paperwork, but they also don't want to do it because they, frankly, think that you're going to have me collect data to show I'm a racist, and then you're going to call me a racist. And so to explain to them how it will be done and be as transparent as possible to the officers, do that. Then we're going to audit the process, because whenever you do any kind of new data collection, there's a startup period where the data is less high quality than it would be later on. People mistake, don't know what the terms mean, aren't sure when they fill it out, all those kind of things. And then we'll cut that off and start the data collection. And so and then we'll be doing analyses and coming back and showing them to agencies and showing them to the commission and trying to help people understand. We estimate that it's going to take about a year of data collection to have enough stops of individual groups to be able to make a statistically significant decision about whether or not disparities exist. And we'll share that in a report to the community through the police chiefs and a broader kind of discussion of that. So that's the broad steps in the process. I can give you details. I mean, one of the questions that always comes up is, how do I know who a person's Latino? Police officers always say, how do I know? Officers constantly say, could you put it on the license? How you self-identify for the census. Well, the reality is, I don't care what a person self-identifies. I care what the police officer perceives the person to be, because that's going to drive the police officer's decision making. If they think the person's African American, and the person doesn't happen to be African American, it doesn't matter to me. The police officer's acting thinking that. And so it's all across the country, they use the perception of the officer as the determinant of race. There's a practical reason associated with that too, which is if I pull you over as a police officer and say, I'm pulling you over because you're speeding, could you tell me what race you are? That car stop is not going to go well. You're going to say, why? What does that have to do with it? I'm speeding or I'm not speeding. What do you need to know that for? So in order to make the interactions between the police and the citizen go well, that's another reason to do it. But mostly it's the perception of the police officer. So we'll be sharing that back with the officers, sharing it with the command staff. And it shows, I can talk to you about it, I don't want to take all your night, but there's lots of institutional decisions that have bias implications that may be unconscious or unintentional. So one agency we were working with, all of a sudden, most of the time, the search rate on a car is about 10%, 15% of the stops will have a search, sometimes lower. Higher numbers if you're a drug interdiction unit because you've seen the interaction and you're now going to pull that person over. But you're going to be in that. Now, all of a sudden on one shift, the midnight to 8 shift, we were seeing 70, 80% of the cars being searched. And we brought this to the attention of the chief and said, hey, look, you got a problem. Can you tell us why this is happening? And she said, no, I can't. So he called his command staff in and he said, we got a problem here. All these people are being searched. They weren't finding anything either. I mean, they were searching them and not finding anything, which is the worst case scenario. Because as you know in your work, if a person's searched and then nothing's found, they're angry. They go to their friends, their family and say, these jerks just searched us And it's only because I'm Latino or Asian or black or whatever, because they didn't find anything on me. So that was the case in this community. But the command staff said something that was really interesting. We just hired 4 new officers, small town. Those 4 new officers got the last half duty, right? Because they're low seniority, so they're working midnight to 8. And the sergeant on that shift is the most green sergeant at the same time. And all they did was take a more experienced sergeant, put him on the shift, and the sergeant went away. But they were afraid. They didn't know what to do. The sergeant didn't know how to correct them. It was just, so a lot of this stuff is stuff paying attention to things that, I mean, as you know from your work, police document everything. You know, they document every arrest, where it is, what it's for, you know, they document, you know, what police officer was involved, they document all the 911 calls, the responses to the 911 calls. They don't document traffic stops. It's the #1 official interaction between police and the community. It's the #1 opportunity to get a positive relationship between the community and the police, because you're gonna have an interaction at the car. Doesn't mean you have to always give a warning. You could give a ticket and still have a better experience for people. But we don't know anything about it. We don't know who does it. We don't know how often it's done. We don't know how effective it is. Now, the question is it more effective to give a warning than a citation? We don't know. Is it more effective to put the car out there with the flashing lights or the "you are speeding now" sign, or put a cruiser there, or pull someone over? We don't know what's most effective. So this gives you some data on what interventions might be more effective in slowing down speeding and that. So I am happy to answer any questions that you have. Yep.
My first question is fairly easy. On the reporting, how often is that done of the data?
The
Back
data?
to you folks.
Well, we'll probably be doing it it's different kinds of data, it's going to report different frequency. Probably monthly or every 2 months, we'll be giving a report, but that won't have disparities in it, because there won't be enough. You know, you guys don't have a hugely disparate community here. You know, you have disparity, but it's not like we're talking about Miami here. And so you need more time. It took us a year and a half in Vermont to get enough stops with people of color to be able to do that analysis. I think our estimate is in a year you'll have enough to be able to do that analysis.
Do you ever get data and decide that maybe you need to change the methodology a little, tweak it as you're getting data in because of big discrepancies in it?
No. If we do decide to change the data, it would be something we would do during the audit period. You know, if we see a category of a form that's being filled out incorrectly consistently, that's a training issue. We need to go back to the offices and say, you know, we didn't train you well enough on this. You're entering everything in the wrong category here. And that's why we have a 2-month sort of shakedown.
So that could happen during the course of this study.
Yeah, so I give you an example we talked about today. One category is that the police want to know about is if they're doing a directed patrol. So let's say there's been a bad accident and they're telling the police to increase patrols on the street where somebody got hurt. If that happens to be a street that has Latinos, Asians, African Americans on it, you're going to get more stops from that. So they should be able to indicate that on the form, and that's fine. But some agencies, if you said directed patrol, none of the officers will know what that means, because it could be targeted enforcement, it could be a special action, special event. So they've got to make the terminology work with what the officers know is on the field, what they would recognize it as. And as long as we're meaning the same thing, it doesn't matter that it's maybe called something different in a different agency.
Then I had a second question. That question being, you mentioned something about the officer's hesitancy to participate in this kind of a study because of the fear of becoming known as a racist, so on and so forth. Do you have a methodology to protect against that and to address the officer's concern in that regard?
Right. Well, there's a couple things. One is to tell them the reality is that it's not no police chief has been fired strictly because of data, right? But police officers have. And so, you know, the question is, what's going to be the progressive discipline what you folks do. If an officer is identified as participating in this, then what would happen is the officer would be made aware of it. If the officer, and work with their immediate supervisor to correct it. An example, one officer went every day to the same housing development and ran all the plates of all the cars that were parked in front of the housing development. When he had a hit on warrant, he'd wait there. And when the person got up to go to work in the morning, he'd pull them over and get an arrest. Okay, it may be good policing, it may not be good policing, I would argue it's not. But the problem was it was African American housing development. He didn't do it at the white housing developments. If he had done it in all housing developments, okay, we could have a conversation, but if he only picked the African American one, no, that's wrong. And so, but once that was known, he just thought he was doing good policing. He wasn't saying, I'm gonna do this just to get African. I'm getting a lot of people on warrants. And then the department said, no, we don't wanna do that. If we wanna do that as a strategy, we wanna do it at all the housing developments, not just the ones you pick. And so it can, okay, so then you give them a chance to change their behavior. If they don't change their behavior, then there's a discipline phase, where they may be disciplined for it. And at the end, you know, you can be fired. It's rare, but, you know, I find most of these are two things. From your perspective, you're gonna be dealing with warrants and complaints of the community. I've yet to find a police department, even in New York City, where this is rampant and you have, you know, a large majority of officers engaging in misbehavior. I think it's generally the bad apple theory. There's a handful of them. Most of them are unconscious bias, and a few are racist. And the racists are easy to find. If you all know this. If I go to a police department and I say to them, who don't you want to ride with? They all know. If there's a guy who's really, you know, acting based on racial bias, they all know, and they don't want to be with that person. They don't want to get jammed up when he does something stupid. So those are hard. It's not hard to identify those people. They're very rare in policing. It's not something that we find a lot of. You deal with people, you know, I've done a lot of work with police oversight boards too. So you deal with a lot of people who may be more violent than we would like them to be, more quick to use force. But in terms of me identifying people who are racist and wearing a badge, it happens, but it's rare. Most people, they don't know what they're doing. They're doing it for the unconscious reasons that we all carry around in our head.
I guess when I heard you talking, I heard that the concern of the officers that were going to be asked to participate in this study, one of the concerns was, well, if I answer this truthfully, I might fall into that deplorable bracket.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no methodology in the study to prevent that from happening.
To prevent it,
I mean, there's no anonymity in the study. The officers are going to be identified.
officers are going to be
So
identified.
that's a risk that's going to be there no matter
Yeah.
what.
Yeah,
Okay.
but two things about it. The officers are gonna, with our experience, just our experience in the past. In the beginning, some officers are gonna say, okay, if they're gonna make me do this, I'm not filling out the damn forms. I'm just not gonna do it. And we can identify that right away. Then they're gonna say, well, I'm gonna write everyone down who's white. I'm gonna tell everyone who's white. And we can then check arrest records of individuals who were stopped to see if the race is the same as when they were booked. And so we have ways to check, to identify if people are, playing with data. My history with this is simple. There are police officers who say, I'm not gonna do this, I'm not gonna stop people, I don't wanna get jammed up, I'm not gonna stop people. But you know what? That lasts for 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Then some idiot drives by them at 50 miles an hour in a 20-mile school zone, and they just are good cops. And they just go do their job. And they're like, to heck with these stupid forms. I'm not gonna let them kill somebody. And they just go back. So there generally is a little dip in the number of citations issued when we first start the paperwork, but it's usually done within 6 to 8 weeks, and then they're back to where they were before. And we monitor that. So.
Do you mind, can you speak a bit, give us a little insight about how what they have to do as officers as far as the documentation?
Sure.
This is all to the traffic stops, right?
Yeah, well, it's gonna be interesting.
Any stop.
Any stop, pedestrian stops or traffic stops. But The biggest increase in workload is that they have to write something down on a verbal warning. Because in the past, they would just say, you know, don't do it again, you were going too fast, you know, if the next time I'll have to write you a ticket, go on your way. And there wasn't any documentation, they have to document those now. So, there's two ways they can do it. The city of Lawrence owns a data collection screen as part of their RMS system that exists. They don't use it right now, but they've already bought it as part of their system. So we're just set up a patch for them to pull that screen in, and they can fill it out. We're gonna adjust the screen to the kind of categories that they were talking about today, so it has the same thing, but it's right there. So that'll just go into their RMS system. Takes about, on average, 30 seconds to fill out the information on the form. You know, more when you're first doing it, but it gets down to about 30 seconds. So the officers will have to do that. They'll have to say what the reason for the search is. That's something that they can just search now and they don't have to provide that information. Depending on what the departments and the commission decide, they'll probably have to give a little bit of data that's addition on the type of stops they did. So for example, and they're deciding this, so it's not something we've given them, just options that other people have done. But for example, if somebody stopped for going 3 miles over the speed limit, that's a highly discretionary stop. Not every officer is going to do that. If someone's going 25 miles over the speed limit, everybody's going to pull them over, just about. So some departments collect it, stop speeding under a certain threshold and speeding over that threshold, so they can get at the high discretionary stops where the driving behavior may not vary that much. So those kind of things are what might be a category that they have to collect, but it's a checkbox. It's just one of the checkboxes that'll come down.
So they're filling out on the mobile and the car?
In Lawrence they will.
Okay.
In Eudora and Baldwin City, maybe not. It'd be on paper there, I think.
I was gonna also ask, if you don't mind speaking a little bit to the benchmarks.
Sure.
For this community.
Sure. There's two areas where the benchmarks are for everybody. If benchmarks are, if I tell you that Lawrence police are stopping 13% African American, what do you know? Is that too many? Is that too few? I don't know anything about that. How do I make any kind of determination? So then we have to compare it to something. And so the early research compared it to census data for Lawrence. Well, that's dumb because, you know, not everybody in the census drives. Children are in the census, they're not, drive. Elderly drive at a lower rate. And lots of people who come to Lawrence don't live in Lawrence. So if you pull them over, then, So a second method of benchmarking was what they call adjusted census, where they adjust the census to some number of towns around that are contiguous to your town, saying that those are the people most likely to drive into your town. And we've done some fairly sophisticated models that have push-pull kind of things. How many kinds of entertainment do you have in your town versus the other towns? People are going to come in for your entertainment, colleges, those kind of things. We've done that. You can also do stops of just residents to the residential population, age corrected. There's another benchmark that's legitimate. The best one, though, is interesting, is traffic accidents. Not at fault traffic accidents are probably the best benchmark so far that we've designed to know who's driving on your roads at a time. Now, the benchmark should be this. The actual benchmark that you would want is who's violating the law and under the observation of a police officer. And of those, who did you stop? If you could get that universe of who's violating the law and who do the police officers see, then we could say, okay, well, why did you pick this one over that one? But we can't do that, because we don't know which ones the police officer perceives. So we're trying to do the next best thing. And we try to get close to that, and traffic accidents are about the best number. We use multiple benchmarks for that. So we use 3 or 4 different benchmarks. But then, the research shows that we have real mixed results on whether or not race predicts who's going to get pulled over by the police. Some studies have found it, other studies have not. But in what they call post-stop analysis, which is after the police officer pulls you over, goes up to the car, has a brief conversation with you, and has your driver's license, then we have consistent patterns of racial disparity. And that is, we don't need a benchmark for that. So that's whether a search was conducted or whether a person got a warning or a citation. Because the universe is everybody that got stopped, and now we just predict it should be equal among the people. You stop them, you know, it shouldn't be that there's a racial effect on who gets a ticket versus who gets a warning. Now, you're in a single community, so we've had lots of experiences where the community standards on that issue of a warning versus citation are very different. So we've talked about it with Robert. In Providence, Rhode Island, the police chief is there. If you're gonna pull somebody over, I want you to write them. That's my policy. I don't want warnings. I believe tickets change behavior. So they have about 85 to 90% citations on their stops. Down the road a piece, in Newport, Rhode Island, they have about 90% warnings on their stops. And their policy is, the tourists are our business. We don't want to be giving them citations. They're not coming back next year if we give them a citation. So, you know, so it's very much, you know, community driven. And sometimes in a bigger community, it's district driven. There may be districts that, you know, they want more enforcement and districts that don't. So, you know, it can be very different as you look across them.
Yeah, for football game day, that'd probably be good for us.
Exactly. Exactly.
My question was this pro forma or sheet that you're going to prepare of data collection, is that going to be shared with the public?
The council, as a representative of the public,
No, means public means we highlight it in the community that going forward for a year or year and a half, if you are stopped, here's the kind of data somebody will collect.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. I thought you meant for public comment and
No,
to
no.
just be
But-
alerted?
Yeah.
I would think we'd
So
want
it
to
would be
alert them.
proactive.
Yeah, I think we'd want to
The
alert them that
community
the
would
study's
want
gonna
it.
go on.
Yeah, community would want that.
Yeah, that would seem like a good idea, to let people know that that's gonna be collected,
Yeah.
you know.
So somebody just lets them go, that person can come back and say, look, they didn't ask me this, they didn't do
Right.
this.
One of the challenges, to be honest, one of the challenges is that, and this is something, again, it goes back to normal, but it's human nature. Police will say, I am leery of giving someone a break. I pull him over, he's going 7 miles over the speed limit, I wanna give him a break, but now I know that I'm documenting this stop, and my supervisor's gonna know, and what's my supervisor gonna say? And that's part of the training. We have to train the supervisors too, that we don't want them to use this as a discipline measure. This is just documenting stops. And at the end of a period, we'll be able to say if there are any issues here that you wanna deal with, you know?
And you talked about several ways to authenticate the data,
Mhm.
check the reliability of the data. How much disparity do you find when you do your studies?
In what way?
In what the officer has reported and what you, how many errors or how many mistakes or?
It's generally in the race field. That's the one that's biggest, you know, we don't, citation versus warning seems to be fairly, that's not something that they fool around with, the race field does. And there's error on both sides, because one of the challenges is that police officers don't ask you your race even when they're booking you.
Yeah.
They just book you and they just write what they, it's an uncomfortable question. Why would I ask it? I'm looking at you, I'll put down what I think it is. So the error could be on the booking side or on that side. But if we start to see a pattern, then that's something we bring to the attention of the supervisors and say, you know, these 3 officers, now we won't know who the officers are. We have unique identifiers for the officers. We don't have the officer's name, but they'll have a match list where they can identify the officers if they want at the individual police department level. So we'd say these numbers are consistently reporting different than what shows up in the booking thing. You might want to talk to them about it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Tony, do you have a question?
I have one,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, bias-based decision-making, of course, goes farther than just race or perceived race. What have you considered as far as benchmarks or the like with respect to gender?
We'll be looking at gender. We'll be looking at gender. There's some really good work coming out. I mean, one of the things that doesn't work, and maybe it will in this, who knows, but has not come up in the previous studies, is the stereotype of an officer alone at 3 o'clock in the morning pulling over a young woman and keeping her there for 2 hours. Now we'll be able to identify those because we have the link to the stop, we have the gender of the person that's being stopped. That's something that we'll be looking at, but that hasn't been a consistent pattern that we've been able to identify. However, what has started to happen is looking at women of color versus white women. Women of color don't get treated like men, but they don't get treated the same as white women. They're more likely to get searched and they're more likely to get a citation. And so documenting that is important. It's a smaller number, but it is important. And we'll be doing that.
Well, going one step further, the gay community, the lesbian community, how, you know, is there a benchmark or is there even an attempt to judge police interactions?
Some communities have. Some communities with a large, active LGBTQ community have tried to measure that. Your benchmark is a wild guess. You know, it's generally some community statistics around, you know, advocacy groups' estimates of what the population size would be. You have a college community, so you're going to have much more of active groups in that world. Asking officers to identify it is really, really hard. You know, so most of the studies have not been able to get good data on who was stopped, who was perceived to be LGBTQ. Trans, maybe, but you know, the trans community is being picked on and harassed in a whole variety of fashions. And you know, it's something that maybe that in Lawrence, the Lawrence police chief would like to keep track of, or at KU, keep track of that. You know, at KU, where they're going to be doing pedestrian stops to pay attention to that's more of their activity, particularly around sporting events.
Can I follow up on your question? So
Sure.
one of the things we have realized is there are some overtly identifiable characteristics, and that's where you are stressing. But as Tony said, some of the things not easily detectable, but we may be answerable for some of those things too. So in that category, have you looked at social class?
We look at, as a proxy for social class, the officer won't have the occupational history of the person when they pull them over.
Driving or something?
Yeah, the car, the vehicle, there's a proxy for that. It's not perfect, but they do the make and model of the vehicle, year, and so you got a little bit of a proxy for that. It shows up in equipment stops, you know, and when you have a college town, you're gonna have lots of students driving cars that have equipment issues. And so knowing that, because those are high discretion stops too, you know. A tail light out is a discretionary stop. Obviously a muffler hanging behind the car is less discretionary. You know, that's kind of.
Any further questions?
I'm just curious, I guess, more than anything on this question, if you have, I'm assuming you do have at times some commonalities that resonate out of these studies that you tend to find. I guess I'm curious of that and what you recommend back. I guess I'm asking some of those commonalities. I'm sure there
Sure.
are some of that.
I mean, I think that there's two things, and one thing I didn't say that I should say, because it bears on what you folks do. There are commonalities. Searches. There are far too many searches where people don't find anything. As I said before, that only alienates the public from the police. But when you look at it though, some police officers are really good at it. Because we also collect the hit rate, what's found in the search. So we know the search was conducted and did they find a gun, did they find drugs, did they find drug paraphernalia, whatever. There's some officers that are really good. And their hit rate could be 50, 60%. In other offices, it's 2%. Well, you do some training where you say to the officers who are good at it, what are you looking for? Teach these other officers what you're looking for, because, as you know, training of one officer to another officer is the best kind of training, as opposed to an academic or an outsider. If they can talk to each other about how they find that, that's really important. So that's one of the things that does come up. The decision on warnings versus citations, once it's something that they're counting and making a decision about, because right now cops are just doing it by the seat of their pants, who looks like they're being a jerk, who looks like they're a good person and I want to give them a break, you know. A lot of times it's who looks like me, it's lots of things like that. So when you're starting to look at it and say, why should we be doing that? It starts to change practice. But the point that's important for you all is that the best practice, and again it'll be decided sort of towards the end of the study, is to take this data and go to your community and share it. To have community meetings and community forums where you say, here's the data, here's what we're seeing, here's what we're doing about it, and you know, you probably wouldn't share the name of the officer, but you share the patterns. You say, we have an officer who's doing this, and this is what we're doing with the officer. Amazingly, what these meetings do is the community believes the police care. As you all hear, you talk to the community of color, you say, have any of you ever been pulled over because of your race or ethnicity? Every hand goes up. If I talk to the police and I say, have you ever pulled anyone over because of their race or ethnicity? Absolutely not. I took a constitutional oath, I would never do that. Well, how can we have these two realities? The people are all saying it happens and the police never did it. Well, when you get a meeting and the police say, we're looking at our traffic stops, we want to know if there's disparities, we want to get rid of them if they exist, the community's not worrying so much about, did you get the number down to less than 2.2 over the disparity, is you're looking, you care. And that goes a long way towards restoring relations. Communities love to have meetings with their police where they have data. It's not a story, an anecdote. My kid got pulled over, but that didn't happen here. It happened in, you go someplace else, and you get this defensiveness. This is just data. Here's what we're looking at, and it shows that they care. So our experience has been those meetings tend to be things that the community values, and they don't blame the police. They thank them for caring.
So we can expect, so the data will be only released at the very end of your...
To the public, yeah.
Okay.
Because the issue everybody wants, I mean, there may be, but we won't have enough data on stops of individual groups of color until about a year after we've done it. So I can say statistically I have enough cases. I couldn't release something that had 3 stops in it and say, this is a pattern. So.
Dr. David, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Very
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank
Good
you.
luck on the board. That's a lot to complete by the middle of 2021 if your 2-month options or 3-month options are extended.
I just wanted to add thanks, Jack. I just want to add a couple things. The question about public information and interaction. So we had a public information meeting in January. We plan to schedule those throughout the study and invite the community in. But we also want to go to the community, so we're reaching out to KU, Haskell, universities, in contact with NAACP, and as the researchers come back and do site visits or I may just go and present, we want to be able to have those conversations regularly and engage the public. I think that's one of the first things that Jack told me when we started was this won't work unless the community knows about it, is involved in it, and then the second thing I wanted to share was that the desire would be that when we're done with the study, what will be left in place will be a system to continue with each agency if those agencies desire to do that. So they'll have a template for continue to gather if they choose to do that, and that would be our hope that they would, and have a way to analyze their own data. So it's not a one and done, it would be an ongoing process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
item on the agenda is to update on the ordinance change request that was made to the city council and consider revision to the bylaws. I made three recommendations based on our minutes and our previous meeting to the council, and I guess we're going to end up talking about also a bylaw change as part of this. Let me just give you a very quick rundown of the briefing to the city council. The easiest one was the original wording in the ordinance is, and it's Article 2, Section 3 of the bylaws. Be a resident of the city of Lawrence or own a business within the city of Lawrence. And amongst ourselves, we had thought that that you know, a resident of the city is more likely to have the knowledge and be more up to date of what's going on in the city than somebody who merely owns a business. The city council took note of that, but they also noted that all of the ordinances that the city writes, they have been making a large effort to standardize all of them, and they are not eager to make the ordinance on the police review board a special case. But I think it's fair to say they recognize that if somebody were proposed to be on the police board and didn't have a reasonable degree of knowledge and participation in everything in the city, wasn't just an absentee landlord, you know, that they would be, since they would be reviewing the same kind of questionnaires that we all filled in, then the city is not going to change the ordinance, you know, solely for the police review board.
I think they also noted proximity as an issue too, that they wouldn't have someone from Wisconsin, right?
Well, I'm the one that said
Or- or you
Wisconsin,
the one-
and so.
okay, someone said
Yeah,
Wisconsin.
that's part of it,
Yeah.
but they also brought up the idea that, there could be, allegations of bias-based policing and the like, relative to, you know, businesses and ownerships of business, or how the business interacts. So the short answer is that I don't expect that we would see, I don't expect to see the city's going to change the ordinance based on our recommendation for that. The second recommendation we made concerned the wording of what does the board do when it receives a complaint. The original, that's Article 8, Section 3 of the bylaws. Board members, as currently written, it says board members shall receive the complaint in a confidential manner and shall not make specific inquiries of the complaint beyond the scope of information necessary to ensure the complaint form is properly processed. And we pointed out that as a board, we don't have the authority to make an overview of whether the police properly processed that complaint or the like. I think the council saw the intent of that as the board's job is to make sure that our part of receiving the complaint and forwarding it is done, and so in that sense, that's what we're doing to properly process the complaint form internally. That was their intention. So I didn't see a whole lot of support for that, but we also requested maybe that the bylaws be made a little more specific or some direction to it. The last one is a little more difficult, and that was the question about what do we do when we're reviewing a allegation, you know, that or an appeal to the police review, to the police's, department's findings. And we had a problem with the wording that says, in its review of the police department's factual findings, the board will review the evidence but not reweigh it or make any witness credibility determinations. And we proposed saying the board will review the evidence, or alternately deleting the whole sentence, and that way they would just say we review the evidence to decide whether to accept the police department's findings, and if we conclude the evidence isn't sufficient, then we do something about it. This, I believe, this Article 40 that I have in front of us, is that responsive
So
to our question?
I didn't know what it would be
Space
numbered, so I
mark.
just put XXXX. It
Yeah.
would be numbered eventually. But this was just a proposed addition to your bylaws, and you can provide direction to us on how you'd like to phrase it, but it was kind of a first attempt at explaining the substantial competent evidence standard, because if you'll recall from the meeting, the commissioners had an interest in having the board use some sort of a standard of review so that you know what you're doing when you go into executive session. So they did want to keep what we have right now on substantial competent evidence. So this bylaw draft just tries to explain what that means and give examples of when you would have substantial competent evidence and when you would not.
The first thing, to my embarrassment, is when I went back and looked at the bylaws, I didn't find a specific article in our existing bylaws that really tells us how to do. So having this straw man is useful in that regard. We'll give a minute to let people read it again and see what the comment is. The intention would be that the board would make a recommendation to either adopt this as part of the bylaws or recommend modification and specific wording that we would again decide whether that's what we want to adopt as bylaws. Is that correct?
Yes. And the commission would have to then actually approve the bylaws that, once you take action on those. I see a quick show of hands. Has everybody had an opportunity to read it? Okay. Comments?
I have a comment on the sentence in section 1, beginning, for example. I'm not sure, I think maybe I know what the intent of that is. Let me ask Diane. Is the intent of that to show or to indicate that a finding that there was no misconduct could be based on evidence that you had inconsistent statements, so on and so forth, but you had an admission from the complainant, and that you could find that there was no misconduct just based on the admission of the complainant? Is that
I'll
the
try to answer
intent?
that. Right, it's just the appeals that you all will see will be really fact intensive. It's difficult to give you examples that will apply directly to what, so these are just 2 examples, but if you have a statement by a complainant that says, I was having a bad day, or I admit that maybe I did report something that didn't actually happen, that could be really significant and that could weigh into your conclusion that there was no misconduct, yes.
So what that example is attempting to convey is that the board would have the authority to find no misconduct based upon just the admission by the complainant, regardless of what other witnesses might have said.
Right, well, your role on the board is not to determine whether or not there was misconduct, it's whether the police department had their conclusion is based on the evidence.
Well, I'm just going by what you got down here. It says that would support a finding of no misconduct.
Right, so
I'm trying to keep it.
that the police department's finding of no
Yeah,
misconduct should
okay.
stand.
But it could be, my question is, can that be based on just the complainant's admission, regardless of what any other witness said or whatever?
I think it could be, yes.
Okay. All right, that answers.
That would be a significant piece of evidence.
I personally think that's pretty confusing, and maybe we shouldn't try to do the examples.
Okay.
Because they are very you're right,
Right.
they're very fact intensive, but if you've got a complainant's admission, I mean, that's pretty much it.
Right.
Ballgame, isn't it?
So when we met with the commission last week, we told them that we could revise the bylaws and provide some examples. So we can certainly not do that until the commission, we decided not to provide examples, but if you have any ideas on how to strengthen the examples that we do provide, that might be.
The only thing, I had to spend about 10 minutes trying to figure it. I finally got it figured out what it was all about.
Okay.
But at first, it looked like it was very conflicting in what evidence you could and couldn't
Okay.
consider. But maybe it isn't confusing. It just took me a while to figure it out.
And please keep in mind that as you go along, there may be additional clarifications that you want to provide and things like this. So if you don't decide to include examples in this now, but later you do, you come up with something that would be a good example, the bylaws can be amended as we proceed, and it may be very appropriate to do that as this unfolds.
Yeah. I actually like how this walks you through it. I like how the example is speaking out about the substantial competent evidence, and that's a great example because it's very, very substantial at first to the person saying this is what happened when in fact it didn't. So I mean, I think that's really good the way it says that. Not to be opposed to you, but I just think that really is good. I like that how that spells it out because, and I'm getting because we're getting kind of the same messaging here is I think we're all kind of cringe when we say we'll not reweigh it, and I think not having been on this type of board before, for Community Police Review Board, I'm getting kind of the bigger picture, and I understand that we're not really to reweigh it, but we do have to make sure that we're clear that is it substantial, is it not, and there is a line, and I understand that, and I think this spells it out pretty good, that it's really telling us this is, if it's there, this is where we go, if it isn't, this is where we go. And I think it's very, very clear all the way through 1, 2, and 3.
So my suggestion, take it for whatever, is if we could separate the examples from the section, so put that in a different font, so that organization, because the examples may change, more likely the examples will change rather than the law or the whatever we call it. So have an indented, for example, if this happens.
Not make it look so.
Yes, dense. It starts to.
It's kind of a run on.
Yes, because only till the collusion is what the issues
Right.
are.
If you did that, Doctor, you would start with
for example?
And then
Yes.
however.
Okay.
Yes, as a subset.
However, it's also-
and the entire rest
Yes.
of that paragraph?
will get
Okay.
embedded.
Yeah.
Right,
And then future boards can ask, can we change this example?
well, of course.
Because
Okay. Any other comments?
so our comment still is on that second line in section 2, second sentence. Therefore, in the review, the board will review evidence but will not reweigh. It will not make witness credibility determinations.
So the way I'm taking this is, and it does to me make sense now, that it is or it isn't, and if, and then we come back and say there needs to be additional, because if it's, here to reweigh it, we're saying we're gonna take it to another step, we're coming back to give this direction, we're saying this is what we're suggesting to the city manager, and blah, blah, and do something about it.
So, for example, when we say don't review, you review the evidence but you don't reweigh it. Let's say that there were 2 witnesses that provide a statement. Your job is not to say, I believe witness A more than I believe witness B. If witness A said something that would support the conclusion of the police department, then that's a factor to consider for substantial competent evidence.
And I think we should remind ourselves, I know Sergeant Ernst has offered, I think we haven't had something, which is good, to have to deal with on an appeal, but that he would come speak with us and address anything if we have questions, so we have him at our disposal, which is great.
And ideally, much of this will be recorded as well.
Well, let me ask you something on your example here. If you had a case where you had 4 witnesses, all testified basically to the same thing, the complainant said, now that really what happened, said something else, that's substantial. You can't reweigh that, is that what you're saying?
So we previously talked about how strong it would be for the complainant to say, no, that actually didn't really happen, it was untruthful. So it would be up to you to look at what the police department's conclusion was and determine whether you think that the complainant saying that, even though there are 4 witnesses saying something else, was enough for the police department to conclude on. I know that's a bit confusing too, but was it reasonable for the police department to base its decision on this one complainant's statement as opposed to considering the 4 other witnesses? Was the complainant's testimony substantial enough to rely on?
Well, isn't that reweighing it to a certain extent?
Not really. You're concluding.
I can
Or are you doing credibility? I'm saying that I give the complainant more credibility than the witnesses.
No, not necessarily.
Then how will I flip the decision?
If the police department found that there was no misconduct, you're asking how you could find that there would be.
Yes.
That's not your role to determine whether there was misconduct. You're just gonna give a recommendation to the city manager that the police department's finding is not supported by substantial competent
Yeah,
evidence.
so how will I do that? How will I come to that conclusion?
You'll look through all of the evidence and determine whether there's enough relevant evidence that is of enough volume to support the police department's decision. You're not saying that you believe one person over the other, you're just looking for whether there was enough evidence to support.
You're looking for substantial competent evidence.
Right.
Not just enough. It
Well,
isn't
that's
just
another word.
right.
Substantial competent evidence means that there is a relevant evidence that is substantial, so it weighs pretty heavily in support of whatever the conclusion was.
But if I meet that recommendation,
Right.
or if the group makes that recommendation, they're basically not agreeing with what the police department did. Fair enough?
Can you rephrase?
Because the police department found there was evidence of whatever, mispolicing. And we want to say there was no evidence of mispolicing.
Well, I don't think that case would ever come to you because somebody would not probably appeal a finding that there was no misconduct. What do you think about
They would not appeal a finding
that there was?
that there was misconduct, because they didn't technically somebody's complaining that they're dissatisfied with the police service in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So if we say, yes, we agree, we won't be talking about that one, it would be the opposite.
Well, here's my problem with the example. And I think you're right. Only those cases where there's been, that the police department has found that there's no misconduct, those are the only ones probably ever to get appeals, that we're ever gonna hear. In your example, you're saying, as I read it, there can be all kinds of evidence that would not support what the police department found, but the complainant is now, at some later date after he filed his complaint, is now saying, well, no, I did it, basically, I'm confessing. People make confessions for all kinds of reasons and under all kinds of circumstances. And I have some difficulty with having a case that you've got supposedly uninterested witnesses saying this is what happened. You've got a complainant that originally apparently agreed with those witnesses, and now for some reason that person has changed their mind, or at least in the police record that's what it shows. I gotta start questioning whether that guy's playing with a full deck, or, you know, has he been intimidated? What's going on?
I think that's a good example to show how this is really fact intensive. So when we first talked about the weight of just a complainant, going back on what he or she said, that would seem really important, but now when you give an example, well, now there's all this other evidence. Maybe, I think it will just change based on the...
Wouldn't that be this board reweighing the evidence then? I'm not trying to be obtuse, but this example really gives me some pause.
Which, the example of the complainant going back on...
The complainant.
Maybe the scenario may not parallel. I can think of two scenarios. Let's say complainant comes into the police department and says, officer did X. And then we go into report and they say, officer did X, correct? So now we have your 4 witnesses that are jiving with the initial report from the complainant.
Wait a minute, I'm not following it. Yeah.
Because you're saying that the complainant makes an allegation of X occurred.
Yeah.
Then we have 4 witnesses that also substantiate it. They were
No,
there.
no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where you have 3 or 4 witnesses. Oh, substantiating what he originally says.
What the complainant originally states.
Okay, okay, I'm following.
So now we have 5 people at one point, and even independently, so we're not questioning the veracity of their statements. We believe them, the complainant, and these 4 people. Now the complainant has decided to change his or her story for whatever reason. And maybe it even might be known to us. We can go, oh, I think they're changing the story because we don't know why. It is still highly possible, I can't always place a guarantee, that the police department would find that the misconduct did occur based on these 4 witness statements. Another example would be, is you have witnesses that are saying an officer did something to what would be a complainant. You go talk to said complainant, and they say, I don't remember, or they say, I do not want to participate in this. It still does not mean that based on these 4 statements, and maybe some other information, video, etc., that you can still not find misconduct in the officer. Is that clarified? And also, a complainant changing their story when it's now still being substantiated by 4 other people who are really impartial witnesses, that could still allow for a finding of misconduct. Or vice versa. If you have a complainant saying X occurred, then you go talk to 4 people, they're like, this didn't happen at all, it actually happened this way. Then of course that would change our course as well. Did I muddy the waters, or did I help clarify?
Well, I guess I'm trying to get mine as simple as possible. The board sits here with a finding from the police department wherein the police department has found no misconduct based upon the statement or the confession of the original complainant, in spite of the fact that you have 4 witnesses that say, no, it did not happen that way. And we get that in that package. So that's what we're trying to decide. If I'm sitting here, I'm having to say, wait a minute, I got 4 disinterested people saying it didn't happen that way, and the police department made a decision based upon this one complainant who changed his story. Why'd that happen? I mean, with 4 people that say no, just the opposite happened. You see what I'm talking about?
I see what you're talking about, and it's a hypothetical basically saying, oh, complaints retracted.
Yeah.
But we still have, it kind of goes back to what I'm saying, a lot of times, even a name and a phone number, even innocuous information, that where somebody sends out the signal to the police department that some sort of misconduct occurred, sometimes we don't even need to talk to the person, or they won't talk to us, or we're able to substantiate it via other means. So, I never say never, but with your scenario, if we have 4 other people saying that this misconduct occurred, and an uncooperative or a complainant who's wishy-washy, I'm gonna use your terms of not playing the full deck, the probability of the misconduct still being found by us having a finding of misconduct is very high. But I place no guarantees because without dealing with the reality of the true stories being told and the other nuances, I can't guarantee it.
And I would agree with you, but this example is exactly that scenario, that improbability. That's what this example is. So that's why I have a problem with the example.
Would you have a problem if
Just take it out.
if you struck just and/or an admission by the complainant? That phrase right there. In other words,
That makes it even worse.
does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
We could maybe come up with some additional.
For
And you
example,
see-
if
you
the
see what I'm
police-
talking about?
I do.
I mean, the officer's right. I think it's very improbable that's ever gonna happen, but
That's
that's
the
what this
extremes that we're
example
trying to show. That's what we're doing.
But that's not a case which will come to us, because
Well, a couple things.
you have shown a misconduct.
I get it. The moral of his story is he wants the wording in the bylaws correct. But
Okay.
that's really your sole focal point, and I don't even know if I'm necessarily addressing that. But you are correct. This would not, because now we have a complainant who's uncooperative, who's not, so because we're ultimately gonna find then saying back with the 4 witnesses who are corroborating the initial statement from the victim, we will find misconduct, and so unless you have then have a complainant saying, I don't think you could, they wouldn't appeal that.
And that's the substantial evidence.
Yeah.
That's the point, to make it, I mean, it's so far, but it makes it substantial for the example.
So you wanted to take a.
No, well,
I guess it's not confusing to anybody else, so.
I do like the idea though, of pulling it and pulling it out of it so it's
Simplify
not
it.
so running.
you know, the and/or admission by the
Yeah.
complainant that he or she was untruthful, as a general example, does that add anything to that paragraph? I mean, is there, given that this may or may not be likely, does that phrase and/or an admission by the complainant that he or she was untruthful, is that necessary for a general example that is given in section 1? In your opinion, yeah, in your opinion.
Yeah, because
Okay.
that portion about the, let's see, that he or she was untruthful,
Yeah.
that's the whole thrust of that, is that you could have all this other evidence, but if the person admits it, there's no misconduct.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, yeah, to take that out of there.
Well, I have 2 questions. The first is, a reasonable person. When I have read this all along, I've sort of said, can I, as a reasonable person, can I put myself in the police shoes, seeing the evidence that the police saw, and would I make the same conclusion that the police did? In other words, I'm putting myself into the position of what Sergeant Ernst saw. I'm sitting here as the reasonable person reviewing the evidence as Sergeant Ernst might. Now, is that is that substantial, competent evidence? Or, you know, am I making a competent decision? On the one hand, I would think that's the kind of approach we ought to make, and on the other, anyhow. If I had the information the police did, would I have found the same answer, or would I have made the same findings as the police? Does that constitute what you're talking about, a reasonable person and substantial competent evidence?
So your role is to review what the officer did, not step into the shoes of the officer. Any time that this standard of review is used by other boards, or appeals boards, or courts.
I'm sorry for the interruption. I'm not talking about me standing in the shoes of the officer against whom the complaint is made.
Right.
I'm talking about if I were standing in the shoes of Sergeant Ernst, for example, as a person charged with reviewing the professional behavior of the officer against whom the complaint is made. To me, that sounds reasonable. That's the approach I've taken. You know, that's how I've read all of this along the way. Because that leads into the next question. There's actually a third possibility, isn't there? And the third possibility is that the board might feel that it doesn't have enough information based on what findings the police had, what witnesses, whatever it is. The board might feel that it had some additional questions it wanted to pose, not reinvestigating or anything, but just common sense says this doesn't answer this question. So the board has the option of going back to the city manager and saying, we're not able to make a finding, period, and would request that this additional information is provided. Do we have that? That is what a reasonable person would do, in my estimation.
Done away by the first sentence, it is reinvestigated.
Well, no, we're not reinvestigating. We're saying that the information in the investigation has come. And yes, we agree with a finding of misconduct, or yes, we agree of a finding of no misconduct. But what if, in looking at it, we find ourselves on the fence and don't feel that we can fairly come down on either side? Do we not have the option of saying that we have this difficulty and therefore would request additional information? We're not doing the investigation, we're going back to the manager and the officer of professional assessment and saying, tell me about this.
The ordinance does have language that states you can make a recommendation to the city manager on whether additional investigation should take place. So if you find that there's not enough information and you need more information, it can get kicked back to the police department. And that's in subsection D of 2504.
Okay.
I'm sorry, subsection E, the very last paragraph.
Of course, I don't have it in front of me, but do you have it? Here it is.
To Tony's point, because I've kind of made that point out as far as going back to the sergeant, if we said, look, you know, we need some additional information, do we want to consider maybe putting something in here, not where we're reweighing it, but if, and I don't know if we need to or not, because he's obviously offering to do so.
Okay. And make a
Thinking, wondering if we need to put
answers my
something in
question.
that
Yeah.
permits or allows us to ask for time with him
Right.
to talk about where we may have some lack of some information, we feel like we need more.
If I could just check something in the ordinance quickly to address your question. So there's language that executive session is gonna be carried out under chapter 75 of the Kansas statutes. And there is some language that states that the board is allowed to take in any person to their executive session that would be helpful to the board. So there can be cases certainly where Sergeant Ernst, if he conducted the investigation, could go into executive session with you and answer questions. So if you don't know the answer on the spot, you could just ask him there for clarification.
That really doesn't, Tony, I mean, it's just
Yeah, that
kind of what
answers
you're asking
the
for. So,
The last part of this is reading the bylaws. I will suggest for the consideration of the board that this draft article become Article 9 of the bylaws, and then the bylaws be renumbered, because this talks about receipt of complaints. Then the next thing would be investigating of complaints. And then the others pieces of the bylaws talk about quorum and training and open meetings and records, etc. So it just seemed like this would flow better if this investigation of complaints became Article 9, and then everything subsequent to that was renumbered.
That's good. I would propose move.
Okay, so as I see it right now, and I'd like to go ahead and put this to a vote.
Can we go back to one real quickly, section
Sure.
1? Okay, so I understand what the points that you were making with regard to that. Are we still moving example down and those are staying there?
That was what that was going to say.
Okay.
For purposes of a vote amongst us, the recommendation would be that section 1, actually the 3 sections remain as written, with the exception that the example is indented so that it is clearly an example. And that the article is numbered as Article 9, and the remaining articles are renumbered. So there's 2 pieces. A, the example is indented, and B, it becomes Article 9.
Okay, and then just another clarification, maybe question. On section 1 then, just going back to what you said and thinking about section 2, is that we are just looking at the substantive evidence, which may be consistent, or in whatever manner it is reviewing the evidence along with the decision that was made to make sure it's there, right? Okay, I'm just trying to simplify it a little bit, but not too much. And so I'm just wondering if the examples could reflect that a little more, or do they like a maybe a little more succinct? Is that or do these work?
I think if I gauge the city's intention in this, we're providing an example, but even in providing an example, it may or may not follow from everything.
Okay.
So we're sort of we're providing an example. It's not telling us how we're going to conduct our investigation. It's merely providing an example. That's what it's going to be indexed.
We don't provide investigation.
Well, no, I'm sorry. We're going, our review of the investigation, and maybe, you bring up a good point. Should this in fact be the subject to be changed
instead of investigation of the complaint, should it be evaluation of the complaint?
As I understand this board's duty, it's simply to, one of the duties, the ones we're talking about right now, is simply
Right.
to review a finding by the police department on a
So
complaint.
that's what it should be, review of findings,
Misconduct.
PD
Right.
findings,
And
review of
make sure it's
PD findings.
substantiated or not,
Yeah.
right, based on the evidence, yeah.
So,
Is that the intent of the city commission?
so what would you suggest?
Review of PD findings.
The, yeah, review of police department findings,
Yep.
okay?
Or decisions, whatever.
I like the investigation, but I had to stand on that because I think we're looking too deep into.
But they are based on complaints, that's the only
Yes,
time they come
it is.
forward, right? Is that what triggers it?
Yes.
Typically, yes, there's an
Yeah.
external,
Right.
yes. It could be an internal review, but mostly somebody's presented themselves to the police department and expressed some sort of discontent.
Okay, so let me do this in 3 parts. I'll make the recommendation and we'll vote on it. For section 1, as the bylaws would remain as draft written, with the exception of the example is indented.
Second.
I would indent and however, do for example, and then however, so they're separated because they're 2 examples. I mean, it's one example and another.
Two paragraphs.
Why don't you
So
make
another
two
paragraph with our,
a subsection example?
another indented paragraph.
That's even better. Okay,
Way they're very clear.
well,
I mean, it's,
you know, example. In the indent, then they would become examples. One paragraph would say, if the police concludes, and it follows all the way down. A completely different example, new paragraph. Second thing would say, if the police department concludes, that would be a second underneath the example. And the, a third example could be that is basically taking section 3 up. In other words, upon the conclusion of the board's confidential review of an appeal, the board the board makes a recommendation to the city manager that additional investigation by the police department is warranted. So I'm just saying, so the first, yes.
Third one becomes a decision.
May I,
Third one becomes a decision, so I would leave
yeah, I
it.
think
may I make a suggestion on section 1?
Okay,
How about if you, where you go to your examples, you make a subsection A, and it says examples, and then you have enumerated examples
Fair
under
enough.
that. How about that?
Yeah.
call it scenario A, scenario B.
Just on section 1, that's all I'm talking
Mhm.
about right now.
Mm-hmm.
Would there be anything wrong with that?
No,
Would that clarify anything?
I want this to read less dense.
yeah, if we just
It
pull
would be
it out.
easier to cite
Yeah,
it that
clean
way,
it.
is the reason I'm suggesting.
I have one more little thing on section 1. So on the first sentence, when appeal is requested in a timely manner, please.
Yeah.
Right, or Mario?
read a
I
lot of
talk too
letters
long
like
and I
do.
read too much.
I read a lot of letters.
Okay, so we're, as of right now, we're saying this is the draft of Article 9. The subject is review of police department findings.
That's what it says.
Section 1 stays the way it is until the text that starts with 4 examples, that is renumbered as Section A.
1-A or 1.A, whatever.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Subsection A. So that would say if, in subsection A, examples, and then the remaining part of that paragraph.
I would just enumerate your examples as
Yeah.
they come along.
And so in other words, what you're saying is the second part that says starts with however, would that be B?
Well, the first one would be A1 if, and then A2 would be however.
Yeah, okay.
So I like,
Now like A2, there you go, that's great.
I like what Bill is saying is that once we make a recommendation, we can say, per section 9(1)(b), we agree.
Yeah,
But we don't agree, so
Okay,
that
so-
may help us,
so we have a
right?
subsection that says, example 1A, that starts with if the police department concludes, A1, and then a subparagraph A2 that basically strikes the however, or leaves however in, leave the however in, but A2 starts with the however if the police department, and that, to me, makes the section 1 read okay.
And we're correcting a grammatical issue in the first sentence.
And we're correcting the when an appeal is requested in a timely manner.
As
As set out.
Set out by the ordinance.
You want to abide the ordinance, since we're under that. Any other,
Good.
do I hear a recommendation to approve this?
Motion? Yes.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
Thank you for your work on this, and
Yeah.
especially the clarification on section 2 was good, yeah.
We'll get that placed in your format and then we will forward that to the commission for their approval.
Will this entail any changes to the ordinance? Because we changed the bylaws,
There will be a change to the ordinance.
corresponding change, right?
Not regarding what you just discussed. This is just in the bylaws.
Okay.
But back to the what you had forwarded to the city commission originally, they were willing to entertain one change to the ordinance that related to the section 1-2504A8. And that's something that we'll be preparing for the commission to consider. So we'll have an update for you at the next meeting, certainly, and in between there, once we get it prepared and scheduled, I'll advise the board.
We sort of got overtaken by events in the time that we've ended up working on this, which I still say is important. But in article, number 5 of the agenda, talked about a brainstorm and follow-up discussion based on the police department's end-of-year engagement report. And one of the questions is really that I had has already been answered, which is this isn't going to dovetail at all with the police study per se, the one that Mr. Benecki and everything. So, but one of the questions I had in terms of brainstorming or discussion to follow up on that presentation was, how does the police department gauge whether the engagement is effective? And the second question relates to that, and that is, what additional outreach should be made to invite participation of, I would generally say, disadvantaged groups?
So currently there's no data that the police department gathers to determine the type of engagement that we're getting with the community. So I don't have data that would go off of for that. And then I think, there's a lot of things that the department does within the community. However, it's more of when people reach out to us, they want us to come speak at an event or come to their neighborhood association barbecue or, give a presentation. There's a couple of things that we do proactively, like the Coffee with a Cop events, the community safety fair, and some other things that we put on. We host ourselves. I think we are definitely open to any recommendations that the board may have to help us maybe reach some of those populations.
Sergeant Rose, so recently the chief had reported about an outreach and interaction activity with the Islamic Center that occurred after the events internationally.
Yes.
Recently, was that something that the police department initiated or was it the Islamic Center that they kind of had an invitation to visit? Do you know how that came about?
I think I know, but I think it would be more of an assumption.
Okay.
I know that the chief has a relationship with the center and they have communication with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that after those international events took place, that the chief and a captain and maybe even some officers did go over there in some sort of event, but that did not process through my office as public that I would track.
Right. But I wanted to give that.
I guess I'll just say this, that what triggered a lot of my questions was when you were talking about the safety day and the observation by some of the people that attended that was sort of, gee, I didn't know this, or I'm glad I came, etc. And my question was, did or should the police department specifically go out to black churches, Islamic centers, etc., and advertise or invite those organizations to attend and participate in this type of safety event that the police department is providing, and using that as an example from the standpoint of, rather than only, that sounds pejorative, but only welcoming people that came,
should the police department be actually inviting organizations to come?
Sure, I think you make some really great points, and those will be some things that we'll consider as we begin planning for the second. Last year was the first time that we've done this, so, you know, we didn't really have anything to gauge on how to do it. It was just a couple people at a table with several organizations in the community, and we teamed up together and we put on this safety fair. And so this year we have a little bit better idea, and I will definitely jot down your ideas and your thoughts, and we will, you know, try to take some of that into consideration this year when we are getting vendors and promoting citizens to come attend it.
So I just follow up on what Tony is saying is, one of the criticisms, or I don't know, comments, is a better word to put it, could be that the public engagements are areas that we want to go to, the police department wants to go to, rather than where it should be going to increase interaction with the minorities. You're trying to invite them, and I was going to say is you go there. So instead of having to invite, we'd say, oh, I would,
It's both.
yeah, I would go to the LGBT community on campus and talk to them, rather than do an open house and see 2 people coming. So I would be more proactive, and then keep a record so that we know end of the year we can report out to the community to say, look, these are so many people we touched, and we touched them across a broad spectrum. That would make us look so good.
And it's just called intentional outreach, right?
Yes.
It's just
Yes,
saying,
intentional.
okay, this year, these are the things that we're gonna do, next year, these are the things we're gonna do.
And you can pick and
We're
choose.
gonna reach out to the LGBTQIA community up at University of Kansas, or going to Black Lives Matter, you know, to speak, or whatever. I mean, you know, that are very Haskell, or whatever, you know, this very specific outreach that law enforcement does to engage with the diversity that's defined here in our, culturally here in our community. So, like, example, Captain Squire, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but one thing that he does, and the Lawrence Police Department does, is reaches out to our community at Haskell by serving on what we call a meso level committee that plans all of our health, safety, and wellness activities, and all of our active shooter drills and all of that. He's a very active, engaged part of our community, and that's, I think, intentional for law enforcement. So, you know, that to me is outreach. He doesn't have to be there, and he represents the whole Lawrence Police Department. There are other ways in which we can do that, certainly, but I'm just using that as an example. So then the Lawrence Police Department says, we are engaging with Native Americans in the communities in this way, because not all Native Americans that live in this community are at Haskell, you know. So there are other activities that are Native that occur in the community, like Fried Bread Fridays at the Methodist Church over on Haskell and 21st Street, right? So things like that. I don't know. I'm just saying, you know, so you're covering the
But
diversity.
even something like that, I kind of now know when you say it, but even though it's like, hey, have you thought about this event? Have you thought about
Yeah.
this location? For this intentional outreach, right? And that's,
We can
instead,
help you.
it'd be nice to know, it's not as the idea of intentional outreach, but say, hey, go here. Those places would be very much appreciated.
That actually gets to a fundamental question. Does the police department feel that it actually knows where the centers of influence are within the various communities?
Yeah.
There's an Islamic center, okay, that's a good place to start. There's Haskell, there's a good place to start.
Can I feed off of that?
Sure.
Because I was gonna add, and maybe we can, you know, I don't know what you all know, but I mean, there's trans communities, there's Network Q in this community, there are a number of LGBT, I mean, there's a combination of all kinds. And I think if maybe we need to feed some of that back to help enlighten you. So, and kind of going back to when we kind of ended the conversation last time, and it was just, because I actually interviewed Jay Pryor before this evening, and he's on the Human Relations Committee here, but he's big in the trans community and such. But I started reaching out and asking a number of them in different groups, because I really wanted to get, you know, and it resonated to me, which I understand from my own community, is that people don't feel safe in these marginalized groups to come without that invitation. Or if we start this, I like the idea of the intentional, is we intentionally start that and do those outreaches, we would eventually, I would think, start to turn the tide.
Right.
But even like the information and the one, and I already, I'm gonna butcher the name, something about Q, that group, whatever, what the group you just said, if you're like, hey, this person is a good contact person, we will intentionally reach out and say, hey, we'd like to meet up, we can have, find out what, be intentional.
Sure. Well, that's wonderful.
So, along these lines, the question maybe I should ask is, if you went to one of these groups, how do you think your reception?
Oh, I can answer that.
That's mildly irrelevant.
Because it should not be
Okay, so,
relevant,
back to
because
the
we need to
reach
build
out.
that trust level up. Because we want to be a community police rather than.
Sure.
So I was thinking, like, for a group, just for hunger group, when they do an evening thing, can a policeman or somebody do an outreach with them? These are the sort of the homeless, lower in the pyramid kind of people. Can we help them?
We have
But then I was
options.
wondering, is if the sponsor would say, if you come, half my crowd will not come. Then at least there's a data point, anecdotal data point for us.
I think at this point, since it's getting late in the evening, I think all of us have come up with a basic understanding that if we are in fact aware, using the Q group as you, Network Q, thank you. As we individually become aware of groups, because somebody mentions it to us or membership or whatnot, we can forward these things on and be proactive, which is part of our thing about making recommendations to the police department for community outreach and communications, which is part of what the ordinance tells us to do.
I had one other thing I'd kind of like to, and I don't know what you do, so forgive me for just kind of throwing this out at you. But one of the things that resonated with a couple of people that I interviewed before this evening was they asked, what's the police department, what are you doing as far as training to understand the marginalized groups, such as the LGBT, the trans? I guess I just asked, do you get training for that?
Yeah, we can, once again, kind of back to this topic, I wouldn't begin to speak on all of our training, but I can definitely get somebody who can talk about that, or we can compile that information as well.
And something to go with that part, and I would love to have that information because some of the groups are asking. But some of the things that they keep saying as well is, if there's not training or if there is, let's kind of start that conversation. And with that, once again, when we're talking about being intentional, some of the kind of the speaking people, the contacts with those groups would love to be a part of the discussion when a group gets together to obviously then partner with you or one of the officers. So that way you're using their expertise in their community, if you will.
We could get more information and follow back up on that.
Okay, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Any other discussion on that? Okay, next item on the agenda is,
Can I pause 1 second? If you have people that want to interact with the police department in a training forum, if you could once again provide the information, we will take it and we can speak to that. There's no barrier to that. That'd be a good start.
And you're talking
Offer
for training,
Sure.
for training potential?
Yeah,
Well,
I
and
place
with
no
outreach,
guarantees.
and with outreach, if
Yeah.
there's a community
Okay.
that wants us to get involved with us, please give them my contact information or email me their information, and I'll reach out to them and we can figure out,
But,
how to make
Yeah,
something work.
I won't wait on the next meeting. I will.
back to the network queue, I would not blindly show up as a uniformed police officer there out of respect to what's going on, because many people right now are different, no matter what they're doing, don't just want the police showing up to their functions.
Yeah.
And so, but to reach out and have a point of contact and say, hey, let's work out a time where we can show up, whether it be network queue or something going on in Haskell, if you provide names and phone numbers, we will reach out to these people.
Don't. It's not that they don't like the uniform,
I
because some
didn't
of them
say
do
that.
like that.
No,
Walk in the room.
it has nothing to do with the topic at hand,
Yeah.
just showing up to some sort of, some event and they're not expecting the police
Yes.
can cause concern.
Well, sure.
That
So,
was my,
Yeah.
ideally, there's some sort of point of contact where we can do this intentional outreach, and then the person can go, hey, just so you know, the police are showing up today, and it's because we've invited them here,
Yeah.
or allowed them to come.
and let me reiterate, I think you guys do a lot of outreach here.
We do.
If we can just focus it, collect some data on who we are touching, how many people we are touching, that will help.
I just think we can enhance
Yeah.
some of that, because you do phenomenal, there is a lot you do. I wanted to ask one thing, Tony, real quick on the training, if we could just get some update on the Citizens Academy, is there anything on that?
So it's still in the planning stages. We anticipate hosting a Citizens Academy sometime in 2019. But with the shortage of our authorized strength right now, it's hard trying to find the appropriate people to do the specific trainings for it. But we are definitely have a draft version that we are working on to present to the chief.
Okay. Thanks.
In item 6 of the agenda, there's no business to be conducted on March the 28th. Is there a recommendation to cancel the meeting?
Yep.
Okay. Ms. Littleton has made the recommendation. Is
I
there a second?
seconded it.
Dr. Mishra has seconded. All in
One
favor?
percentage.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Meeting schedule.
Now, the next is July?
The
Is it
next
that far out?
schedule is July.
We weren't able to find a date that worked in May, so that your next meeting that we had on the calendar is July the 11th, and then kind of the if needed meeting is July the 17th that we have scheduled. And then there's the meetings in October, and we kind of noted there on your agenda what the specific action items would be for those meetings, kind of as placeholders. So in July, you would have kind of some briefing on this hypothetical investigation steps, as you had talked about, receiving the annual reports on racial or other bias-based policing from the police department, and then approving an annual report that would go to the commission by the August 1 date, I believe, by the ordinance. And then in October there, you would have your annual election of officers.
I'm sorry, did you say July 11?
It's on, yes, and it's on the
Oh,
back of the
I'm sorry.
agenda there.
On the back of this other,
Thanks.
on
It's
back
the-
of
Yeah,
agenda.
got it,
11th, and then the 17th is that if needed
It's back.
meeting. Mhm.
got it, okay.
Something else?
Is there a motion to adjourn?
No, I'm asking if there's something else.
I did not, there's no other agenda items. Is there any other
Yes, sir.
discussion?
No, I was just gonna ask, and this doesn't have to be on record, I just wanna ask before y'all take off if I can get a picture of us, because for my company, we do what's called Bring Out the Good Month. So it's all about community initiatives, and they're asking for a photo. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so if I could get somebody to
I would
take a
have
photo.
shared. I didn't say.
Don't take a close-up photo. But if
Did somebody make a motion to adjourn?
I motion, yeah.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn, second.
Seconded.
Okay, thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yeah.
Meeting
Thank you
adjourned.
so much, everyone.